Where is it?
We'll start some.
Oh, it's in the...
Oh.
This conference will now be recorded.
I'll call the Willmar City Council meeting, special meeting to order for Monday, March 15th at 5:32 p.m. Roll call.
Mayor Calvin.
Here.
Councilmember Fagerly. Osmus. Here. O'Brien.
Here.
Butterfield.
Here.
Osk.
Here.
Davis. Here. Plowman. Nelson. Here. 7 present, 2 absent.
So we do have a quorum, and so we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. And the item that we have on our agenda for the special meeting is City Hall and Community Center financing discussion. And my understanding is that Mr. Gramitz will not be joining us, and that he has asked our finance director, Mr. Okens, and our public works director, Mr. Christensen, to lead the discussion. So I'm not sure who to call on, but am I calling on you first?
No, you, Steve.
I'm sorry?
Steve.
Steve first? Okay. So I'm going to, for opening comments, I will go to Mr. Okens. If it's all right with the council, I'll make a couple opening comments prior to turning it over to Mr. Okens, if the council's okay with that. And we'll kind of take it from there. In approximately October of last year, the council met and gave direction to staff to meet with Willmar 10 to come up with some options for their facility. At that time, it was suggested that one of the things that needed to be determined prior to moving forward with any one project was to actually have a conversation about the financing. This was held through the Finance Committee. There were numerous meetings through the Finance Committee where conversations happened, and we have in our packet a number of documents that were prepared. In 2018, the mayor submitted a thought that we could potentially look at building a new city hall and maybe doing something with the auditorium in the tune of approximately $8 million. At that time, the mayor included that in the budgeting process, and it went for 1 year that those thought processes had moved forward. It was then the next year where the rubber would have hit the road, where we actually had to commit dollars, hard dollars, to make it happen. And at that point, it was not included. It was included in the mayor's proposed budget, but was not forwarded to the full council, and the adopted budget did not include those dollars. That brings us to where we are today. We are very fortunate that the city has been fiduciarily responsible and continues to be through the years. And as our last number of audits have shown, depending upon which year you're looking, we have substantial, what some may consider dollars above what is required for normally operating the city. According to the League of Minnesota Cities, and according to best practices for accounting principles, the last 2 years we've been told by our auditor that we have more money than what we need to be comfortable. And that number is someplace between 70% and 110 to 112%, depending upon which year you're looking at. So I will be in the position that the city has enough money in its monies that has been collected by the taxpayers to make this project happen without increasing taxes or bonding. And I will be prepared to explain how that can happen, but I wish to hear the conversation of the council first. So with that being said, I'll turn it over to Mr. Okens. Mr. Okens, our finance director.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, and I do apologize that Brian will not be here tonight, but I'll see what I can do to explain the information that he included in the packet and some information that I provided as well. Starting off with the committee action form, Mr. Gramitz is looking for a resolution to identify the funding source for the construction of the City Hall Community Center, as the mayor has explained. The percentage that the mayor was last talking about as far as the percentage of fund balance as it relates to the general fund operating budget for 2019, and this information was included in your packet, and I'll talk to that here in a little bit. But the 2019, since 2020 is under audit at the present time, I'm going to use the 2019 actual numbers. The fund balance in the general operating fund was at 80% of the 2021 operating budget. 80% of that was 12.1 million, and that is listed again on page 11, electronic page 11 of your packet. The current 2021 operating budget is $17.4 million. As the mayor somewhat described the history of where we came from and where we're at today, that also is listed on your committee action form. The primary issues are alternatives to consider that Mr. Gromit put on the committee action form is the financing of either project site will require funding from a couple of sources. He lists the reserves at a percentage of 8.5 million. General obligation bonding supported by the general annual tax levy, and that percentage would be the difference if some reserves were used. And we do have Mr. Doug Green from Baker Tilly, who is our bond consultant, on the line and at the meeting with us tonight as well, if there are some bonding questions. And revenue bonds supported by local option sales tax would be that portion that would cover the community center, which was approved by referendum at $2 million. The financial impact that Mr. Gromitz put on his form talks to the $8.5 million from city sources and the $2 million from the local option sales tax, as I just described. Both projects can be designed for lesser finishes and quality, thereby reducing the cost if that's what the council so desires to meet the $8 to $10 million previously mentioned in the previous paragraph. Again, the funding sources could be reserves, geo bonding, as we described, as well as the revenue bonds for the local option sales tax project. Mr. Gromitz listed two options there for geo bonding, and again, we have Mr. Green with us from Baker Tilly if there are questions in these options. The first option goes on to speak that would take the construction of New City Hall Community Center at $8.5 million to a referendum, a vote of the citizens to obtain permission to sell $8.5 million bonds and levy annual taxes to cover the debt payments. Or option two, where the city could decide to build a new City Hall Community Center and through the geo bonding process are required to notify the citizens through a public meeting that that's what the city's intent is. And then if there are enough citizens, 15% as listed there, that would sign a petition, the geo bond sale could be placed on a referendum, and that's what it would take at that point. The next information that is included in the packet, Mr. Gromitz included some geo bonding impacts, talking about if the full amount is bonded for at $8.5 million for 20 years at 4%, it would be about $600,000, which would equate to about a 10% of the current tax levy increase to make that payment. The following information that he provided was some sales tax receipt information to date. This has been discussed with the Invest in Willmar group as well, talking to the numbers of through the most current information is averaging about $180,000 a month, which equates to roughly $2.2 million annually, and that Mr. Gromitz had calculated with a 10% holdback would support $21 million projected debt. Although there are some inflation sales growth, this is based on the numbers as they are today. So there would be some additional growth due to inflation. And possibly, as Invest in Willmar has talked about, some additional growth due to businesses reopening from the pandemic. Also included in your packet were the minutes from the November 19th Finance Committee, where we discussed the fund balance information, the classifications, and the restrictions If you go to page 11, I believe, no, get there in a minute, page 9 of your electronic page 9, the committee action form that was presented to the Finance Committee went through the different classifications of fund balance that are non-spendable. Those cannot be spent legally, contractually required that they are under. There are restricted, and those are externally imposed restrictions by grants, other types of bond covenants, and those types of things, so the council cannot use the restricted. And then there are the committed and unassigned, which the council can use with formal action to change the designation that past action has been taken, or changing policy similar to the fund balance policy that the council has presently in place. It then went on to describe the different dollar amounts, and these are as of the 2019 audit listed, and we discussed those in great detail. On page 11, lists all those fund balances of 12.1 million. Some of those are obligated and would take action for the council to redesignate. Those that I would like to point out are the year 2021 number of $998,000. That number was used to balance the 2021 budget that the council had just approved. We have a couple other ones that are probably should be reclassified to be restricted, and those are the retirees' vacation sick leave. That's where an employee maybe left his accrued vacation or sick leave with the city to be paid out over a period of time. That is in the amount of $197,000. And then moving down, the retirees' insurance buyout. The city, for those new council members, had an insurance buyout program where some employees took advantage of that. Since has been abolished, but there is still an obligation of about $376,000 there. The other funds that you see listed there, again, would go back to what the Finance Committee has reviewed. Most of those are restricted in the sense that they are more in the debt service area, and the special revenue, if you look at the Community Investment Fund, that basically funds the city's 10-year street program. And legally, bond covenants is not. The council has passed a Community Investment Fund, which is also in the charter, that puts a little bit more restrictions on it, but the council can reappropriate if they so choose. The result would be that the property tax would have to be increased to replace those payments of the 10-year street debt. The amount, or the main restriction I'd like to point out tonight is that if the council chooses to use some of those funds, and more of that information is included later in your packet as well, that it would take 7 out of 8 council members, according to the charter, to appropriate any of those dollars. And there are some other restrictions that are spelled out in there as well. But the rest of the information in your packet basically has to deal with the Community Investment Fund, that $9 million, and what their obligations are for the next 10 years as a street program. And with that, Mr. Mayor, I would be happy to answer any questions, or if you want me to explain additional information, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Okay, so we've had an overview. And Mr. Christensen, are you going to be providing an overview as well, or is that the staff report?
Mayor, members of the council, I would take that as a staff report.
Thank you. Next on the agenda then is an open discussion. I will try to get to each and every one of you. If I miss you, try to get my attention. I have Mr. O'Brien, and I'll be watching for you, Councilmember O'Brien. So if you wish to speak, make sure that you get my attention. I'll give you a nod if I see your hand go up. So, Council, any comments or questions that you would like to make at this point? Councilmember Osmus.
Just one clarification. On the general operating fund, and it might have been in there with, but I maybe got lost in some of those percentages. But we're now at 80% that we can cover of the 17.4 million budget. What by law do we have to have? Is it 10%, 25%?
There's no requirement by law. It's a recommendation from what I've been told from our city administrator of someplace between 30 and 50% is the kind of accepted norm. There are cities that go below that, but it is recommended that if you go below that, you have a plan in place to repay that. Is that correct, Finance Director Okins?
Yes, that is correct, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Additional comments or questions from council? Seeing and hearing none, let me throw a proposal out there for the council to consider. And again, we will not be voting on anything today. The numbers that were presented to us were a consideration of a 4% bond rate. When the local option sales tax projects were originally presented, we assumed, for calculation purposes, a 3.25 to 3.75% bond. As we all know, because we just recently sold, and Mr. Green is here from our bond counsel from Springstead, and we recently sold that for 1% with a $500,000 par, and I'm rounding the number to 500,000. So that was considerably less than the 4%. This is a different revenue source if we choose to sell bonds, and so our bond counsel could give us an idea on what they think that bond counsel or what that bond would sell at. But just understand that it might be less than that, and I appreciate staff taking the worst case scenario for that. But on the $2 million for the local option sales tax, if we're looking at the community center side of it, one could assume that those bonds would be right around that same number, probably 1.5. Bond numbers have gone up since we sold. They've gone up a little bit from what I'm hearing on the street from talking with other mayors. So what I would propose to the council for consideration is that we take the funds needed to fund City Hall portion of the City Hall Community Center project from our fund balance with a 1 point in the levy increase until a 50% level is reestablished on our fund balance. So what that means is that the council could consider taking the money out of our fund balances. The finance committee would look at those and make a recommendation back to us, probably, hopefully within the next month, on what they would recommend on how we would do that. They would recommend changes that would be needed, so it would be totally transparent on how we did it and where the monies came from. And then secondly to that, we would have a repayment process in place, understanding, similar to when the mayor proposed putting funding in for City Hall and it was removed by the council, that there is a mechanism in place to repay those funds. So we are taking the money, we're basically borrowing from ourselves rather than borrowing from bond. And I would recommend that we bond for the local option sales tax portion, which would be the $2 million. And I would recommend that at a full $2 million without the 10% contingency. So that's something for the council to consider. Sometimes it works better when you've got something out there to chew up, and I'm throwing it out there just so you have an opportunity to chew it up. This is a way to do it. You can say, Mr. Mayor, I don't like your idea. I think we should do X instead of Y, and I'm totally okay with that. But I want this discussion to happen tonight. I want us to make a decision. I want us to give direction to staff. And I don't really want to tie it to dollar amounts, because if someone's going to build us a city hall and you tell them that we have $33 million, I'll bet you they'll build us a $34 million plan that they'll bring and present to us, and we'll have to cut something out of. So you know that Invest in Willmar sat in front of us and told us they thought they could do the project at the JCPenney site for about $8 million. And in your report, you'll see that Mr. Gramitz has identified that that number has changed to approximately $10 million at this point. So it has gone up $2 million. That lies right into the increases that we're seeing in building costs. There's a direct correlation to when we were given that number and didn't act to today when those building costs have went up that much. I was talking to a supplier last week, and on a load of 2x4s, it has went up 300 points on a load of 2x4s since the first of the year. And so our numbers aren't coming down, they're going up. The only reason I say that is the numbers that were presented back in 2017 at the retreat were good numbers. But the numbers have changed from 2017 as we've continued to work on this. And so 2018, it's in our packet tonight, that was a high priority for us to do City Hall. If you choose not to do anything, I'm fine with that. I have no problem with that. But let's get let's get it out there. Let's discuss it tonight. And then if we want to just say, hey, it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen. And then we can put it all to bed and our staff can start working on other things. Councilmember Osmus.
Okay, I just need a clarification on terminology on two things. The first thing, when you were talking about the fund balance and taking, how much did you say?
I said take the cost of the City Hall.
Okay. You're talking about the general operating fund, correct?
I'm talking about the fund that our auditor has told us that we have someplace between 70 and 110% more than we need. Mr. Okins, I think, just referenced it at 80%. Was that
Yes.
right, Mr. Okins?
That's correct, Mr. Mayor, and the auditor does talk, to clarify Councilman Osmus' question. He does, that percentage that he was talking about was the general operating fund only. That's correct.
Okay, because it's like, we have the emergency funds, we've got the industrial development funds, we got the capital improvement funds. So when you were talking fund balance, I wanted to make sure we were all on the same page, that it's the general operating fund. And then when you're talking about City Hall, are you not including community center then?
What I'm saying is $2 million of the funding would come from the local option sales tax. Both of the projects would be combined,
Okay,
but $2 million would come from the local option sales tax.
okay.
That's what
I
I'm
just,
saying.
I wasn't sure if you were saying we just do the City Hall side and not the community center side. Okay, just wanted to clear that up. Okay.
Just Councilmember Nelson.
It feels like we've been doing homework on this for a long time, and the project was set aside because there wasn't a funding source. And so I think that's the other part. When local option sales tax were prioritized in those things, we had set this aside because there wasn't a funding source. I'm not opposed to looking at what you're talking about, but having just gone through all of the fund balances, I think we need to be fair to our community, and maybe we need to do a worksheet. Where would you get $10 million from the general fund figures that are there? And how would we operate differently without those funds? Maybe there's a balance there somewhere between, maybe we have to raise taxes some to accomplish City Hall without taking away all our reserves, with us still not knowing, we're not out of the woods yet with what's going to happen this year or next year. And, we've got to be positive, and we've got to find a way. If this is the top priority, and we're talking about community center, then I think it changes some of the other local option sales tax priorities too. So I'm a little conflicted with what comes first kind of thing. And that's what we're here tonight to talk about, City Hall. I was kind of prepared to think that we could maybe come up with a couple of $1 million in fund balances and bond for the rest. I think the other thing to clarify, when this proposal was brought forward before, it was total bonding. We weren't looking at taking funds. We're behind on streets, we're behind on stormwater, we're behind on other things. So I think to be fair to our community, we probably need, if that's a request, then send finance and staff back to say, where can these funds come from without changing our life? I don't think this is the time to just spend all of the cash that's been set aside for a reason either. Is there somewhere in between that might work? If people are prepared that maybe we raise taxes 5% and we look at the other. But I think local option sales tax, the two projects to me need to be reviewed together, because if we are going to move ahead with community center, I believe we've been told if we do these other projects, there isn't local option sales tax dollars to fund some of this either. So wanting to try to sort through what to do next, but I think we need to be real that somewhere in between. I'm not sure we can just take $10 million of reserves and, we've been paying things back. Part of that's what these balances are for. So I'm concerned.
Okay, let me try to address a couple of those concerns. This has been an issue that we've been trying to talk about, and it hasn't been talked about. I'm surprised, as the chair of finance, that you're saying we need to try to look at where we can find these funds, when in October we said we should look at it. I know it was brought up a number of times during the budgeting process we had council members saying, hey, let's talk about this, and it wasn't talked about. And so I'm just trying to get it on the table and have the discussion. As I stated in my opening comments, if you choose to go a different direction, I have no problem with that. If you choose to say the project is dead, then it's dead. I have no problem with that either. I laid out something, and if somebody else wants to lay out something else, and I kind of heard you say a little bit about, well, maybe half and half, if that's what you'd like to lay out, then we maybe have two edges that we start bouncing off of. Or maybe another council member says, well, I would like to maybe make it this. But I'm just saying that there are the tools in the toolbox to do this, if that is the council priority. If it is no longer a council priority, which was established at the last work session, or the last retreat that we had, then let's take it off the list as a council priority, because our staff, we hear from them continually that they're spinning their wheels and not able to get things done because they're always working on projects. Let's take this then off the table and let them work on some of the other projects that, in their opinion, has more priority. So I have what I threw out there is just an idea. I'm not locked into it. I'm not saying this or that or the other thing. And we can go back to 2018 and say, well, Mr. Mayor, you said that was going to be bonded. Absolutely I did. But I put a proposal out there, and I had moved it forward, and I had the funding in the budget, but it didn't happen. So to say that we never had the funding, yeah, we did have the funding. It wasn't moved forward. The mayor did propose it.
Can I respond to that?
Certainly.
Okay. Well, I do want to defend the Finance Committee, because I think we have worked hard on this, and we have looked at it hard. I also think that the community needs to understand it was out there in 18. The funds that were put in there to make the payment were now absorbed into the budget the next year. Well, if you start to look down, we have a process right now of having almost $1 million of carryover from one year to the next to supplement our budget. So if we use that cash, now we have a different problem with balancing the budget. So to me, it is complicated. And as Mr. Okins indicated, there's some things that are listed under general fund that we cannot use. And so, if the council wants to look at using them, then I think we need to go back and look at this again. We looked at each fund and talked about why it was there. You've lowered a couple of those to do streets, which was a great thing because we've done that. But can we do it again? We were worried 2-3 months ago, where are we going to get our local government aid? The balance has changed there, but has the future changed for 2022? Is this a time to spend reserves? Because it's no different than your personal savings. You only get to spend it once. And so I think we need to be real to our community that there was an option to fund. That option didn't take place, and it's gone. The funds aren't there in the budget right now. If we want to use some of our cash balances, I think we've got some homework to do to see what we truly can use. And if it's a priority to build City Hall, and that's what this council wants to say, then can we come up with this would work, this won't work? Can we fund the $2 million for the community center portion under local option sales tax dollars right now? That's, I think, part of what I've heard at some of those discussions about what are we going to do with local option sales tax projects, which should come first. So you're right, the council needs to decide, is this a priority this year? Or is it a priority at the next budget cycle? What are we going to do first? And I think that's the question and probably the reason we need to have this conversation tonight, because we're being asked to move forward with 2 large local option sales tax projects. And if we do those, we probably can't have this conversation. And so I'm more than willing to look at it, and it doesn't do any good to say we did or didn't, but if we want to come up and look at a proposal, then send it back and tell them to see where can we come up with and how much cash can we come up with and what's it going to cost us to bond for the rest. That's kind of where I think I'm at. If it's a priority to do City Hall, then let's be honest with the community as to what it's going to cost us to do one way or another.
So let me ask you a question back then. So what is different? So I've heard, it appears to me that I'm hearing the same thing I've heard for 3 years. That I'm hearing nothing new. And it might just be that I'm not hearing correctly, but when this question was raised during the budgeting cycle, during the budgeting process, council members were told we're not going to talk about this now. And so tonight is the night that we talk about it. And that's why we're having the conversation, is that we haven't had this conversation. What I, in my opening comments, stated was that this goes to the Finance Committee, and they come back with a recommendation on how to fund exactly what you just said, and you do that within the next month. And that, again, is an opening comment. That's all it is. I firmly believe the city needs a new city hall. I firmly believe we're in a liability position by not having our staff in a different building than what they're currently in. And we have talked about that ad nauseum as well. We go back to conversations about this for greater than 8 years. And it wasn't until I placed it, and I believe it was 2017, in my proposed budget, when I proposed it for the 2018 budget, that I actually said, let's put a placeholder out there. And I agree with you 100%. The council spent the money elsewhere. But what I'm saying is, this is a starting point. This is a place for discussion. Let's have the discussion. And then either yes, we move it forward, or no, we pull back and we say, you know what? We don't vote tonight, but we're trying to get consensus. And is there a compromise someplace in between? And I'm all about compromise. I'm all about saying, okay, how can we get this done? And we just need to make that happen. I'm going to try to follow the rules that are in the mayor's handbook for the League of Minnesota Cities, and to give council members an equal opportunity to speak, and also in our parliamentary procedures that we adopt in conducting meetings. And so I will try to involve all council members in the conversation. So is there anybody else that wishes to speak? Councilmember Plowman, followed by Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to jump back, and I appreciate the mayor putting out there financial mechanism on the table. It's an option, one of what could be 100 different options. In your option, hypothetically speaking, if we were to do something like that, a financing mechanism for community center, city hall, and we move forward with that financial mechanism, how tied are we, and this is maybe best answered by Mr. Okins, how tied are we to those 2 facilities being one facility? Does that, if we were to choose a mechanism such as that, at whatever proportion, whatever dollar amount, does that then tie us to those facilities being located on the same grounds, under the same roof, a shared structure? separate structures, what would then be our limitations?
I'll maybe go to Mr. Christensen. I don't know if he has the numbers or not, but do we know the numbers if we were going to do standalone buildings? I know that Mr. Gramitz was going to try to get those, but I don't know if he's got those yet or not.
Yeah, Mayor, members of the council, Mr. Gramitz and I talked about that earlier today, and you can't do 2 buildings for 10 million. I know that much. That number may be closer to 12, to be honest with you. I don't know if you can do each for 6 type thing, but under one facility, you're definitely saving some money over the course of both projects.
Okay, thank you for that answer. More speaking to, aside from the cost aspect of it, because I understand that would probably, well, that would be more expensive because you're not consolidating. But aside from the actual cost element, are there legal parameters that would, because one is a local option sales tax project, the other would be a different type of funding mechanism or a combined funding mechanism, whatever. Would there be legal obligations for those facilities to be a certain percentage connected or combined?
Boy, you're catching me totally flat-footed. That did not come up into my realm of potential conversations this evening. Mr. Okins, do you wish to speak to that?
Can I clarify maybe?
Mr. Mayor, members of the
You might have an
council, and I will ask for Attorney Scott and Mr. Green to somewhat maybe follow up on my comments, but I think the legal aspect of it would be when the financing project is put together, if the intent is to do bonding. Since the mayor's proposal would be bonding for just the community center, that separation would have to be somewhat spoken to in the bond sale documents. Since the city hall portion, as he proposed it, would only be fund balance, I don't think the restriction would be there, but I will defer to Mr. Green and Mr. Scott to maybe follow up comments on mine.
I'm going to see if Councilmember Plowman has any clarifying comments after that statement.
Well, I'm just seeking to clarify in terms of trying to delineate, because we're talking local option sales tax projects tonight, but the purpose of this meeting, we're talking City Hall Community Center, but it just so happens Community Center is a local option sales tax project. So I'm trying to delineate if there is a clear separation between the two in terms of what our obligations are for funding, and if we use a different type of funding mechanism to fund them both now, if anything changes in terms of requirements for that, like just like I said, whether or not the facilities be all one facility, one roof, or whether the facilities be on the same grounds, or whether they be entirely separate facilities, if there's any requirements that we're unaware of.
Mr. Scott?
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. In response to Councilmember Plowman's question, certainly I will invite any corrections if Mr. Green thinks I have this wrong, but my understanding is in your legislation approving the local option sales tax project, there was $2 million designated for the community center project. That wasn't tied to a specific location or a specific project concept. It just needs to go to something that can accurately be described as a community center. So I think if you have a community center city hall joint project, you basically have an authorization through the local sales tax legislation to spend up to $2 million with a little leeway there, but basically $2 million towards that project. That doesn't mean you have to spend the $2 million from the local option sales tax on a joint facility if you wanted to fund it completely a different way. It means you have $2 million available to you.
Mr. Green, clarification?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, yeah, that is all correct. Maybe just looking at it one more way might help add clarification is if you decided to bond for the total $10 million. Bond counsel would just want to know that you have statutory authority to incur debt for these purposes. As Mr. Scott said, you have the statutory authority you already have it in place for the community center for $2 million, and there's a simple process that you can go through to gain statutory authority to issue general obligation bonds for the city hall. You could sell them together, and again, the bondholders wouldn't care really what you're spending the money on. They just want to know it's a general obligation of the city.
Okay, yeah, that was kind of the gist of my question without getting into a bunch of little minutia, but whether or not that was, that could be one larger, just overarching bond measure. And, yeah, okay, that answered it.
Thank you.
Correct. You can sell them together or separate. It doesn't matter.
I'm going to go to Councilmember Butterfield because he hasn't spoken yet, and then I'm going to Councilmember Nelson.
Mr. Okins did have his hand up as well.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I
Mr.
thought
Butterfield?
Nelson was first.
Trying to level things out, so I'm going to go to you first.
Well, I received a phone call from one of our constituents in Ward number 4. He said I could bring up his name. Can I bring up his name or not?
That's up to you. You're a council member.
Okay, yeah, Brad Hansen called me today. He's all for the city hall. He's not for any new taxes on it. He wants the residents of the city to vote on this. He doesn't want it at the mall. He wants it at a separate location that's going to be utilized, be built just for a city hall. That's the biggest thing him and a few of his friends are talking about. They do not want it out at the mall, and they do not want taxes to go up. So that's the main point that I got from a phone call today.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Nelson, followed by Councilmember Osmus.
I think that we all feel like City Hall is something that this community needs, and it's something that they will use for 30 to 50 years. But I think we have to be honest too right now in that it isn't like the utilities have been setting funds aside for it. We have not done that.
Right.
And we have not had it in our budget the last 2 years. I don't think the council removed anything from the budget this last year.
Nope.
And so this is a roll up your sleeves, figure out, is this a priority? I'm not willing to put ourselves in financial jeopardy to do this. And I think we need to be honest that if we're going to do it, we're probably going to raise taxes to some degree, one way or another. And so I'm willing to roll up the sleeves and see what we can do, but I think we need to be honest that we haven't set funds aside for it. If we use cash balances, we will have to operate differently in different places, and I think that's maybe the homework assignment that we need to do with what can we do without jeopardizing the safety of the community and those types of things. And more than willing to do that, but I think we just need to be honest that the funds just aren't there right now to do it, and that we're going to have to work to find them.
You make a good point to that, and let me respond back to that. A lot of cities, and I know the fire service, so I apologize for always bringing up a relationship to the fire service. But a lot of cities, when they're buying a $1.4 million ladder truck, will take and set money aside for 5 years prior to purchasing it. And then they purchase the fire truck. That's not the way we have done it in Willmar. And the reason we haven't set money aside is because that is just not that's not how we've done it in the past. I have had some of the newer council members contact me and say, Mr. Mayor, why haven't we been setting this money aside? And I've said, because that's not the way we've done business in the past. Do I think that's the right way to do business? Absolutely, 110%. I think we should have set the money aside over the last, when this started getting talked about, I think 2007 was the first time in talking with Mick Schmidt was the first time that it was talked about that we need to get a new city hall, and it was brought to council for a council decision. It was 2007, okay? If we had started putting money aside in 2007, to date, we would have the money to pay cash for the city hall. We didn't do that. Similar to comments that were made earlier, in that the mayor took money out of some of our other reserve areas to pay for streets. We did that because that's what our constituents said they wanted. They said, we want you to put more money into streets. And I believe for 5 consecutive years, I increased, and the council approved, and the council made the decision to increase funding for streets. And that was absolutely 110% the right thing to do. Today, we're at a position where we have to decide, are we now going to take that next step? And let me just reiterate the fact that my position is an opening lob. I do have a piece in there that talks about how do we pay that back, and I stated that in my opening comments, that you increase by 1 mil every year until we get back to the 50% levels. So I did have that proposal in there. What is the rate that would happen? I'm guessing, Mr. Okins, what number do we bring up with a mill a year? Not a whole lot. Is it like 140, 150, something like that a year?
I believe that's what we had discussed, Mr. Mayor. That's correct.
So I mean, it's not like we're going to be bringing in millions, but at least it's something. I do agree that we have a lot of things we're putting on our plate, and tonight, if we move forward with the actions that are on our agenda for this evening, we're going to even increase to the tune of $200 and some odd thousand our annual operating, with revenues about 140, so we have a deficit of about 60. We bring in someplace between $300 and $360,000 a year through increased valuation, is what we historically have done since I've been the mayor. And I anticipate those numbers to not go down, particularly with how real estate sales are going. So that may even go up exponentially. If it goes up 8% of 300,000, it's not a lot of money, but it's something. So I'm trying to move us into a direction. And again, let me be very, very, very clear with the council. If you choose not to take my option in what I proposed, you are not going to hurt my feelings a bit. I put it out there so we had something to work from. Councilmember Nelson has said maybe we need to look at 50% bonds. And again, I'm fine with saying those are the two edges. We bond 50%, we pay 100% cash. Those are the two options. And we work in from that. I'm fine with that. I have no problem. I think Councilmember Nelson brings a very good point. We probably don't want to spend everything down, but I had to get something on the table, right? So that's what I did. Councilmember Osmus. Nelson?
Okay. I totally agree about the not wanting to raise the taxes. When we first were talking, if we were to do this, bond this whole thing, it was going to be 10%. That's not palatable. I just did not think that we were in a position to do that. And I know, Mayor, that you said that you didn't want to talk about numbers, but for me to be able to come up with how we can piece this together and come up with 10 million, I kind of have to talk about numbers of where different pieces will come from. As far as if we get spend some of the general operating fund and we're down to the 50%, which is the recommended amount for operating expenses that the League of Minnesota Cities recommends, we really don't have to, I don't see us having to operate any differently. That is still plenty of cush. Year after year, I believe Westberg Ishins or whoever does the audit has said we have plenty of money. So yes, we technically haven't set money aside for City Hall and the community center, but it is there just because it's been accumulating. So spending it down to 50%, that is funds available for the city's needs. And I don't see, I'm not one, it definitely is, as far as a lot of people will break it down to like their own family finances. If you don't have it, you don't buy the car. If you don't have enough, you don't buy the house. we can make this work. And so I feel like definitely we could get like 3 million from the general operating fund, 2 million from the local option sales tax, and bond for 5. And that gets us to 10. That's a little bit of everything. Now, that brings up, getting back to what the needs of the city and looking forward. There is new federal funding that's coming. The new legislation that just passed this last week. In the other SARS money that came through, we had to spend all that in 6 months. This new one can go towards infrastructure, and we have up to 2 years to be able to use it. So some of that can go to our street needs. That's where we're not cutting ourselves short then for some of our street needs. The auditorium, we still have to address that, and we have put that money aside. We have carried over that money for 2 years.
Right.
So we can still go forward with that. So it isn't like we haven't ever taken a project that we have put as a priority and not put money aside. We're doing that, and hopefully we'll still go forward with the auditorium. Now, the kicker that I'm going to throw in here is the local option sales tax money. As Councilmember Nelson brought up, we had discussed that if we go ahead and bond for the 4 projects, that we won't have the money, the 7 million for the roads or the water, and we wouldn't have 2 million for the community center. So my thought is that I know this will be a discussion at the city council meeting later, but they dovetail and they overlap. The big project is the event center, and that's the one that is going to take the biggest thing to bond for. So if we take that chunk off, we can do is it 6 million for the softball fields and the turfs? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. The turf fields, we can go ahead with that. We can put the 2 million on the community center. We could do the hockey structure for 1.5. And my reasoning and thought on that is the turf fields, the softball fields, a lot of the projects have addressed the youth and youth activities and sports. And again, the senior population, they were in on it through the community center and what their needs are for the community center. And I just feel we need to address their needs, and that to me is a way, and then if we can get the extension on the 13 years, if we approach the legislature to be able to extend how much we can, for the length of being able to capture the local option sales tax money, then we might have the money in 5 or 7 years to be able to go ahead with the event center addition. I think this is doable. I think it's a good move forward, and that's how I would say we do it.
Okay, I got your 2 million from local option sales tax and 3 million from general operating, and then 50% bonding. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay, Councilmember Osk.
Yeah, shifting gears maybe a little bit, but voting tonight on bids for the rec center and for the fields. We've been talking about examining a way forward here to pay for City Hall and the community center project. And I'm going to ask if we're examining ways to pay for these things. I think we're leaving out the stormwater, and I'd love for us to see in this homework that we're doing something included for that as well, because I think that's essential priority. It's a need for the city. Councilwoman Osmus just mentioned using that new SARS funds for infrastructure. I'm interested to know, is that something that could be used for stormwater? Would that be considered infrastructure? Maybe we can, maybe we can't. But if we're going to be doing homework on funding sources, I'd like to make sure that that plan includes the stormwater as well.
Councilmember O'Brien.
We're going to talk about this during the regular meeting, but the stormwater issue just came up, and Mr. Christensen and Mr. Okins are going to be talking about a 3 to 5 year plan to address some of those issues. We're trying to get a plan with municipal utilities and the city, and we'll be talking about that this evening as well. And that's part of the minutes that weren't done because it was a later question that came up during the Monday meeting. So this information will be brought out later in the next meeting. But it is going to take funding, and I'm sure Mr. Christensen can tell you that, as Mr. Okins can as well. The other question I have is I'm looking at the screen, and I only see one person on that screen that's really, for me, it's qualified to tell me if we can afford all this, and that's Mr. Okins. He's our financial director. I mean, I think all these questions, we should be talking with him. I mean, he knows where we are financially. I know we have ideas. He can bring it back and tell us what we can and can't do as financially. I know we got money coming in again with the STARS, but again, he's our go-to person. And I'd like to see us use Mr. Okins more on this. When I was in other organizations, we always used our business administrator before we made any decision when it came to money. And most of the time, we listened to him and followed through. We don't have to, the council does not have to, but I'd sure like to hear Mr. Okins' point of view on all what we're talking about.
Mr. Okins?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I think that the ultimate decision is, again, and I'm not trying to pass the buck, but the ultimate decision is the council's. The budget process and the budget process in the past has built those reserves for various reasons for past council members. Those priorities and policies may not be appropriate for the current council, and that's where that discussion should be. I think a combination of using some of the general operating reserves, the lost and bonding for some of that is a very viable solution to accomplish what the mayor and council wants to do if they want to set the city hall as a priority. To use all of the reserves, again, I think the mayor spoke to that as that was to get the discussion going, and I think the discussion has been good. The finance committee, again, can review options that we as staff are more than willing to provide to them, and then ultimately make a recommendation to the full council.
Councilmember Nelson.
Thank you. I think Councilmember Osk makes a good point, and he used the word homework, and I think we have more homework to do. The sheet that we have in front of us tonight is from 2019, and I think Mr. Okins brings up some good points with our ability to look at this. But as far as coming up with whether 50% is right or 100% is right, I'm not sure either one of them is right. So I think we probably need to roll up our sleeves and do some homework on what this council is willing to handle, and is the community willing to have raise taxes. And I think we can do that quickly. It's complicated because of what we're talking about later this evening, but to just say pick a figure tonight, we're not there to pick a figure tonight.
Councilmember Rasmus.
My understanding was that that's what this session is about, to do our homework, to get all of us on the same table so it isn't just the 4 city council members at finance and then saying, okay, now let's bring it up to everybody. This was our day. This was our special session to hammer this out and move forward and not keep kicking it down the road. We just need to make a decision and move forward. And we have options. And it's just a matter of whether people want to vote for it or against it then. But I don't know what more homework we're going to do. We have options, we pick them, we move forward.
Councilmember Davis, followed by Councilmember Butterfield.
I think that maybe we need to see these options on paper and then have a deadline, a day that we will meet and make that choice. You know, I know we were hoping to do that tonight, but if people need to think about it more, we should have a specific date. And then it's yes or no.
Councilmember Butterfield.
Well, on this, operating funds, how many years has it taken us to get up to that? And how many times has City of Willmar had to dip into it for something? That's one of my biggest concerns right now. Is if we haven't had to dip into it before, then let's use that funds, because what I'm hearing, what I heard today, and what I'm gonna hear tomorrow is no new taxes. That's gonna be what I'm gonna hear from a lot of people I talk with, no new taxes. So I would like to know how long it took us to save all that money, get up to there, and how many times have we dipped into it prior?
And I'm going to take a shot at it, and I'm going to give Mr. Okens an opportunity to kind of try to run some numbers here, maybe quickly as I'm talking. And if you need me to keep talking, just move your arm like this or something, Steve. You know I'm good at talking. So I would guess that these fund balances were probably established back when our former city administrator started with the city. So I'm going to guess that was probably in the mid 70s to late 80s. As Councilmember Nelson has stated, we really hadn't dipped into them until I started taking and recommending for the council to approve, and the council approved taking some of those funds because the constituents were telling us that they wanted streets fixed. And so I started dipping into that, I think 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, that I started taking a little bit here, a little bit there to spend those. Every year, as Councilmember Nelson stated earlier, there are some of the dollars in the operating budget from the previous year that get carried over to the next year, but that's been an ongoing process since the budget started. So that's my explanation. I think I'm fairly close. I'm not exactly sure. Mr. Okens and then Councilmember Nelson.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, you were a little early. It basically started in the early 90s when we informally defeased the bond issues and created the Community Investment Fund. At that time, during the budgeting process, one of the items that we helped build the reserves was to start increasing our deductibles on insurance, taking the insurance savings and funding that insurance reserve that we have today at $1 million. Other items that were done were along those same lines. So basically in the last 30 years, that's been building up. And you're right, Mr. Mayor, the last 4 or 5 years, we've been reviewing those, which we do on an annual basis, and it is on Thursday's finance meeting to review the balances and to look at the policy and to start spending those down based on the state auditor's recommendations on percentages. Now, those percentages are general in nature and simply a recommendation, not taken into consideration the specific programs that we have. But I think that the fund balances as they are today are all specified for specific purposes that the council can certainly redesignate, as I explained earlier on in the meeting, and at what level that they are comfortable with. Just to speak to a few of those, we have a cash flow deficit because local government aid and property taxes come into the city twice a year, and that is in July and December, which is one of our biggest revenues. Also, property taxes are in the same time frame. So we have a $4 million deficit spending between January and the first part of July. That's one of the major reserves. The other reserve I talked about was the self-insurance reserve. And of course, the city charter allows up to 10% of the operating budgets to be set aside for each year. and those we've been reducing as we've gone along. So it's been in the last 5 years that we've been reducing them, and the previous 25 to that is where it was built up.
Thank you. Councilmember Nelson.
Thank you. If I remember correctly, we used one of the funds for the auditorium when we needed to deal with the gun range and and we paid that back over a period of time. I think if I remember correctly in history, when the storm went through, there was money that was used for Baker Field, and I think that self-insurance, some of those. I hear what Councilmember Rasmus is saying, but I'm sorry, the numbers need to speak for themselves here, and they're a year old, and Mr. Okins clarified that a couple of these shouldn't be in there, so let's do, whether you call it homework, if the instructions are go forward and find money, then let's take the time to do it so that we aren't just pulling figures out of the air, and we know what it actually is and whether we can come up with the dollars, because I do believe we're going to have to raise taxes to do this project. And like it or not, somewhere we're going to be in between, either when the bids come in higher or the sale, community center or those things. And, I've said this about the local option sales tax projects, either do it right or don't do it. And if this is what the community wants, then there's a price tag that comes with it. Let's figure it out and see what it is with that. So, I'm fine. I'm fine saying, let's make this a priority and let's see how we can come up with the funds and bring it back with some actual dollars attached to it. I don't think you'd walk in the bank with last year's statement and say, we're going to find the money. Let's be real and do our homework and come up with real numbers.
When will we have the 2020?
We won't have that till October.
Okay.
No.
So that's when we generally get the report. This year, I think we got it in November, I think. So,
Mr. Okins has a comment.
Mr. Okins?
The preliminary audit will be done at the end of March, and the final audit has to be certified to the state auditor by the end of June. So it would be sometime in April that we would have preliminary numbers, and they're not normally adjusted very much.
Councilmember Plowman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm digesting that little bit of information quickly, but I think it's good conversation. What I'm getting out of tonight and what I'm hoping to come out of it with is more of a consensus. Where is the council at regarding a city hall? Are we going to do this or are we not? I wasn't necessarily coming into the meeting anticipating, yes, we are going to do this and this is the exact funding mechanism that we're going to use. But if we have if we leave the meeting with more of a unified, we are going to do this, now we need to specifically, focus in on or dial in the exact method with the exact dollars. I think that gives good marching orders to both the finance committee as well as the council as a whole, because it is a lot more direct. Another point that I want to make, and something that's well pointed out, Councilwoman Osmus pointed it out earlier, that with regards to say the municipal utilities and the projects that they've planned for, they've had specific funds that they have set aside. Just because we haven't set aside the funds, going back 10 years, because we didn't name the fund to set this money aside for, does not necessarily mean, and the community needs to know, does not necessarily mean that the funds don't exist. Another point would then also be too, looking back, and I've been doing this at the council table as long as you have, Mr. Mayor. I understand there can be, it's inevitable. There's going to be culture shifts on different councils when you rotate members in, members out, new mayors, new administrators, and whatnot. What I've realized over some time and with some study is that past councils have opted to bank, to save money and to bank that money, and that is what they felt was right for the city, and that is what they felt was right for their constituents. And I have to respect that, because if that's the action that they took and that's what they believe to be fiscally responsible, then I have to respect that. However, it could also be noted that what I believe was the correct move by the mayor and the city council in the budgeting process is for subsequently taking some of those dollars that were banked and putting them towards deferred maintenance type items. I think we would all understand very quickly, and I think our city engineer could attest, and I won't make him, but if we totaled up the monies that we have spent on city streets, roads, infrastructural improvements, and we could go back decades and allocate the money towards those projects back then, dollar for dollar, it would have gotten us much, much further. So I think it should be acknowledged that while it's a jagged little pill to swallow, that we gotta maybe find a big chunk of money here for a city hall. If a city hall is what we need, and we've denoted that it is what we need, the longer we put it off, the more it is going to cost us. Just like the streets and our infrastructural, our stormwater, those costs, we can kick the can and we can bank the dollars, but we're basically deflating our own money when we do that. And so I'm all in favor of getting on the same page, deciding whether or not our current council has an appetite for this project. If this council does have an appetite for the project, and if what we're hearing from our constituency is that, yes, okay, we accept that we want to go forward, but these are the parameters, then I think that it would be most appropriate then to come to that consensus and then go with the most spearheaded numbers, the latest, the greatest numbers that we have, look into those funds as they sit today and make that kind of a number one priority, because we know what our other priorities are. They're on our agenda for the meeting tonight. But I believe, even though, we've referenced past finance committees and whatnot, but I don't know that we've had it that pointed coming from the city council, the current council, which is, I should mention, is a new council right now, made up of new members. I think it's important to unify one direction or another, or to find out if we're not unified. And so that's what we can easily do. And if we do find out that we are unified, I think that makes it fairly simple to proceed at the finance committee level with our finance director. As Mr. O'Brien alluded to, he knows our money, but as our finance director also bounced back to us, it is still our decision. He can answer the questions that we give to us, but we have to make the decision. He can't throw opinion statements out there very easily. He's got to answer the questions directly. So again, it falls back on our shoulders. But okay, I've spoken enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Butterfield.
Osmus.
You go first. You go.
Okay. I was, just want to follow up on Michael O'Brien's about getting Steve Okins a little bit more involved in this. I'm just wondering if he knows if the city can afford to do this without raising taxes, or if we should just wait, until we get something a little bit more in detail on funding wise. Because I don't want to see taxes go up, and that's what I'm hearing from everybody else. They don't want no new taxes for this. So I'm just wondering if the city could get this done without raising taxes.
Mr. Okins?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I think raising taxes is ultimately going to happen here with any proposal that the council goes with. As Mr. Gometz has in his committee action form, he's looking for a comfort level of the council as far as under the alternatives on electronic page 3 of your agenda, as far as a percentage that would be paid, as Councilman Osmus said, from reserves, percentage of bonding, and maybe the local option sales tax. Any kind of bonding, and I don't know if Mr. Green's still with us, would clarify that we can bond for the sales tax portion and any of the city hall portion together. But my question to Mr. Green would be, is the referendum required if there is city hall bonding included? And then, I don't see a way where this project cannot go forward without some type of property tax increase. Mr. Mayor, you had indicated that even in your proposal, if we use 100% of the reserves, that you would increase 1 mil per year until we reach back to the 50% of the fund balance level, to answer Mr. Butterfield's question.
Thank you. Mr. Green, can you provide some clarification? And then maybe senior speaking, we've got about 5 minutes left of this meeting, and I want to try to get some consensus, so I probably need at least 2 minutes to get consensus. So, Mr. Green, do you have any idea on what it will take to bond, what the bond expense would be if we did the two projects combined?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, to answer the first question, you're right. If you did combine these two projects, as I said before, the sales tax already has authority to issue general obligation bonds. The other process that I mentioned for the city hall, you have the authority to issue bonds without a referendum. However, it is subject to reverse referendum. And so you don't know if there's going to be a petition filed for that would require that. And then, yes, if you put them together, then it kind of puts the $2 million for the community center at risk. Of course, you can always just split them as well. So I'm not sure if that's a main consideration. It's a consideration maybe down the road. Right now, you're talking you started the meeting talking about interest rates, and I know the administrator used 4%. Yeah, which is high. If we did 20 years, which probably would do because this asset certainly has a life of 20 years, maybe even 25. Maybe try to keep it at 20 to make these bonds more marketable. Today we'd be looking at 2%, and I'm hesitant to throw out numbers right now. Even if you did 2.25, 2% on $4 million. I think this is maybe jumping ahead to future discussions on allocation of the balance and bonding. But $4 million is, I think, split in half and half. 20 years, 2.25, we're looking at $260,000. And that is about a little over a 4% levy increase. So Mr. Oakins and I can certainly have all those numbers, available with all those different scenarios very quickly in the future.
Councilmember Osmus.
Okay. Just some quick figures. Thank you, Mr. Green. If I was to go back on my figures that I had for the 10 million, in 2019, we were at 80% for the general operating fund for budget. If we went down to the 50%, 30% would be 5.22, correct, Mr. Oakins? 5 million?
That's correct.
Okay.
Councilman Osmond, 30% would be 5.22.
I think. So we could up the general operating fund money that we use to 5 million. That brings down to go to 3 million for bonding, which then lowers what we would have to raise for taxes. And that works towards people that don't want to see the taxes raised. That lowers it. It still makes it doable. We still get the local option sales tax, 2 million. This is doable. And I think all of the things that we've discussed before, as far as the location and the two together, this is good for the city.
Okay. I'm going to try to see if we have some consensus. And the first question is going to probably to some seem like I'm being condescending, and it's not the intent. Is there anybody that does not want the city project to move forward? Okay. So with the proposals that have been expressed tonight, and I believe we have 3 of them, what Councilmember Osmus just proposed, what Councilmember Nelson proposed, and what my opening comments were, or she didn't propose, she just offered. I think there's three things out there that we could, in my initial conversation was to bring this back to the finance committee, have the finance committee report back to the council within 30 days on what their recommendation is. I've heard a lot of conversation about this needs to go back to finance. And, the problem with that is then you have 4 council members basically making the decision for the 9 of us. And, I kind of agree a little bit that, we were building this to tonight, and we're gonna have the conversation. But it's very clear we're not at the position to where we want to make the decision tonight. So with the information that's been presented, the numbers that Councilmember Osmus has presented, the numbers that I presented, and then what I wrote down, what Councilmember Nelson said when she had made her opening comments, her first comments, we have someplace in between there that we can go. Is that the direction we can give? I kind of hate to tell staff, well, we're kicking it down the road again. We've only been doing this for how many years? But is that the direction we want to go? Because if we're gonna wait until the audit's complete, so we have new numbers, that'll be June. And then, you have a couple council meetings in between. The flip point onto it is what Mr. Scott said, our city attorney. And we already have one council member stating that they're not going to be for new taxes. And so it's going to take 7 of 8 votes. So you're going to have to make sure you have all 8 council members here, for one thing, to have the vote. So, are we headed in a direction, or should we just at this point cut bait and say, let's start focusing on the community center, which the money is there for the local option sales tax? And that we can do. Councilmember Plowman, followed by Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The feeling that I'm picking up in the air is that there is appetite for the project, is that we need to come together with the specific terms and the actual dollar figures. And same as yourself, as you just mentioned, that there's been multiple mentions of the finance committee. But to your point of 4 individuals making the decision, there's no reason that the full council cannot be at those finance committee meetings. That's a pretty important item. So everybody, there's an opportunity for everybody to be involved in those meetings. That would also speed the process up, because then instead of waiting for a finance report and then a council meeting and then another finance committee meeting, so on and so forth, we could all be present for that information to be presented. But then we would also, and I believe Mr. Oken said that preliminary numbers start coming in the end of this month, and then in April, that would be something that we can get to work on. Well, April's only 2 weeks away. So we're actually not that far off from the potential of all 8 of us sitting down at a finance committee meeting and discussing this stuff with specific numbers.
Well, we're also talking about having another retreat on the 29th, so then we could have the whole council there as well.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Councilmember Osmus.
Just a clarification, from some of the materials that we got, it says use of most of the community fund balance are certainly allowable by a majority vote, with the exception of the community investment fund, which has to be a 7 out of 8.
Right.
Is the general operating fund considered the community investment fund?
No.
No, that's what I thought. So we just need a majority.
Right.
To go ahead with,
Unless you're going to take money from the community investment fund, then you'd need.
which we haven't even proposed.
Right.
Okay.
But, and the other thing is that we haven't talked about is the wastewater treatment fund has a lot of money that you could borrow. They've got way more money in that fund than they need as well. And, they've got many years of operating in that fund, I think 1.5 years. And so, so if you had to do some internal borrowing, the finance committee could do that as well. So it seems to me like, I'm not sure where staff is going to go with this, but hopefully somebody can make some sense out of what we're trying to decide here. I don't think we have clear consensus on what we're doing, but I guess send it back to finance is what I'm hearing. Is there consensus on that?
No.
Okay, we're going to send it back to finance and then report. I had said 30 days. Is that reasonable then, or is that not reasonable? Okay, so by the second meeting in April, the consensus is that we would like a report back from the finance committee to the council or at the work session on the 29th, what direction the staff and finance committee are recommending. Councilmember Nelson.
Is that April 29th?
March 29th.
I don't know anything about it.
Well, it's just being talked about.
Oh.
It's in the planning session.
Okay.
And that is, I mean, according to what we set as our rules, the fifth Monday of the month, we're supposed to meet in.
I didn't even know it was the fifth Monday, so
Yep,
there.
it's the fifth
Okay.
Monday, yep.
Haven't heard about it.
Yep. Yeah, nobody has, I don't think, so. I'm working on it with Brian, so. Okay, anything else we need to talk about? I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Second.
The work session is adjourned.